The year is 1347. The air in Europe is heavy, though no one yet understands why. Ships drift into Sicilian harbors, their sails torn, their decks eerily quiet. When the ropes are cast and the first sailors stumble ashore, the stench of fever and rot follows. Within days, bells will toll endlessly, and the world as you know it will crumble into shadow. This is not just history. It is the sound of civilization gasping for breath. You may not survive this story, but before the bells toll for you, subscribe, so you'll never walk these haunted streets alone. Europe in the early 14th century appeared at first glance like a continent poised for greatness. Cathedrals rose higher than ever before, their towers scraping the heavens as if men could climb toward salvation on stairs of stone. Markets filled with voices of merchants calling out prices of wool, salt, iron, and grain. Ships crossed the Mediterranean, laden with spices from the east, fine silks, and treasures that promise both wealth and wonder. From the high castles of France to the wooden cottages of England, life seemed stable. Hard, yes, but familiar. The rhythms of planting and harvest, of feast days and fasting, of war and uneasy peace, all created a sense of continuity. To live in Europe then was to believe that the world, though harsh, was ordered, and that order was eternal. Yet beneath this fragile calm, cracks were spreading. The population of Europe had risen sharply over the past centuries. Villages multiplied, farmland stretched further, forests were cut away to make room for plows. But soil that is overworked loses its strength. By the beginning of the century, the earth groaned under the weight of so many mouths. Famines struck in 1315, 1317, and though they passed, they left scars on memory. People remembered the taste of hunger, the smell of rotting grain, the thin cries of children whose stomachs were empty. Even when food returned, the lesson lingered. Prosperity was not guaranteed. War flickered endlessly. Kings and dukes quarreled. Over land, merchants fought over trade, and in some places, entire towns were caught between rival banners. Still, most peasants continued with their lives, planting, reaping, praying, believing that battles between nobles were distant storms, that only sometimes rained down on them. Religion bound everything together. The church was more than a place to pray. It was the calendar itself, the teacher of the young, the keeper of the sick, and the arbiter of truth. From the humblest serf to the richest king, all knelt under its authority. The church explained why the sun rose, why misfortune fell, and how salvation could be won. Life was full of suffering, but suffering was a path to heaven. People believed this because there was no other voice to offer an answer. Daily life was not glamorous. The majority were peasants bound to the land. They rose with the dawn, worked with their hands, ate bread and porridge, and ended the day in simple huts. Their joys were small: marriages, songs, the rare festival when the Lord allowed them to feast. Nobles lived differently, yet even in castles, the air smelled of smoke and sweat. Life expectancy was short, sickness common, childbirth dangerous. Still, people endured, and in enduring, they believed they had mastered hardship. They did not know what was coming. Beyond Europe's borders, along the great trade routes of Asia, an invisible storm was gathering. Caravans traveled from China, through the steppes of Central Asia, bringing silk, porcelain, and spices. But trade carried more than goods. It carried secrets unseen, passengers uninvited. In distant towns, whispers of sudden deaths were heard, but those whispers did not reach Europe's ears. For most in Europe, the greatest fear was famine, or the sudden raid of an enemy army. The idea of a sickness that could strike whole cities, in weeks that could empty villages in days, was unimaginable. Disease was known, yes, leprosy, fevers, pox, but these were familiar enemies, slow and cruel, not swift and overwhelming. People thought they understood sickness. It came from God's will, from bad air, from sin. Nothing else seemed possible, and so they lived. Farmers bent over their fields. Merchants counted coins beneath cathedral spires. Monks copied manuscripts in dim cloisters. Children chased each other through muddy lanes. Lovers met under the shadow of half-built cathedrals. Across the continent, life pulsed on, fragile but full of hope. But the air itself seemed restless. Seasons grew harsher, storms battered coastlines, harvests faltered again. These were signs, but few could read them. For in truth, the great disaster of their age was not yet visible. It was crossing mountains and seas, carried in the fur of rats, in the bite of fleas, in the crowded hulls of ships. Europe in 1346 was a continent unaware. Its people prayed, worked, sang, and dreamed under the illusion that the order of their world was unshakable. They could not know that within a year that illusion would collapse, and that the very foundations of their society, faith, family, kingdom, and community, would be torn apart by a shadow too small to see, yet vast enough to devour half a continent. The calm before the storm was not silence, but ordinary life. And it is this ordinariness that makes what followed so much more haunting. The invasion did not begin with armies, banners, or trumpets. It began in silence. It began in the dark holds of merchant ships, across the Black Sea, along the routes that connected east and west. Life was moving as it always had. Caravans carried silk, spices, and porcelain from Asia. From ports on the Crimean Peninsula, Genoese merchants sailed their ships, eager to bring goods into the Mediterranean. The sea had always been Europe's lifeline, its channel for wealth, its bridge to distant lands. Yet this time, the sea was also a corridor for death. In 1346, the Mongol army laid siege to the trading city of Kaffa. The battle itself was brutal, but it was not the catapults or swords that sealed the city's fate. It was something unseen. Within the Mongol camp, sickness spread like fire, killing warriors before they could even take up their weapons. Desperate, the besiegers turned disease itself into a weapon. Chronicles tell of bodies flung over the walls of Kaffa, corpses hurled into the city as if death could be catapulted. The truth may never be fully known, but what followed was undeniable. Plague erupted within the walls, and the survivors fled. The Genoese ships that sailed away carried men weakened by fever, their skin marred by black swellings. They brought barrels of grain, cargo of trade, and within the shadows of those barrels, rats. The rats themselves carried fleas, and within, the fleas lurked Yersinia pestis, a tiny force invisible to the eye, yet capable of destroying empires. By the time the ships reached Messina in Sicily in October 1347, the sickness had already consumed the crews. Sailors staggered onto the docks, coughing blood, their bodies burning with fever, their groins and armpits swollen with dark lumps. Within days, Messina was drowning in fear. Officials tried to drive the ships away, but it was already too late. The fleas had leapt, the rats had scattered, and the city had been marked. From Sicily, the plague fanned out like ink spilled on parchment. To Genoa, to Marseille, to the ports of Provence. Each ship that sought refuge brought only terror. Attempts to close harbors and ban traders were futile. The disease was faster than the fear, faster than the ships themselves. It moved with wind and tide, with trade and hunger. There was no declaration of war, no rider announcing invasion, only whispers, then screams, then silence. And in that silence, Europe's fate was sealed. The first cities struck did not fall. With a cry, they fell with confusion. In Messina, panic spread faster than the sickness. Families locked their doors, hoping to shut out the invisible enemy. Priests carried crosses through the streets, blessing the dying. But many priests themselves collapsed within days. Shops closed, bells tolled without end, and funerals filled the air with chants and smoke. The smell of incense tried to mask the stench of decay, but nothing could cover the truth. A great fire of death had been lit, and it was spreading. From Sicily, the plague traveled north. In Genoa, people whispered of a curse brought by the sea. In Marseille, merchants who had welcomed trade ships began to notice neighbors collapsing in the markets. In Provence, entire households vanished within a fortnight. Witnesses described the same horrifying sequence: first fever, then black swellings in the groin and armpits, then bleeding beneath the skin until dark blotches spread across the body. Those who caught the sickness often died within 3 to 5 days. The speed was what made it terrifying. One could dine with a neighbor in the evening and find them dead by morning. Terror hollowed out the cities. Streets emptied, doors were nailed shut, and carts rolled by filled with corpses. Survivors fled to the countryside, believing open fields might save them. But they carried the plague with them, and villages that had never seen a ship soon faced the same blackened death. The chronicles from that time speak with disbelief, as if words themselves could not contain the scale of what was happening. It was as if the air itself was poisoned, one monk wrote. Another swore that the end of the world had begun, yet it was not the end. It was only the beginning. The fire had been lit in the south, but the winds of trade would carry it further, north to France, west to Spain, across the Channel to England, and deeper into the heart of Europe. Wherever ships docked, wherever markets bustled, wherever people gathered, the plague would follow, and as it spread, it stripped away not only lives but the illusions of safety, order, and certainty. Europe, so sure of its strength, was about to learn how fragile it truly was. The plague did not announce itself politely. It came like a thief in the night. But once inside a household, it revealed its cruelty in unmistakable ways. At first there was fever, sudden, intense, and consuming. A man who had risen healthy in the morning could be shaking with chills by dusk. Then came the swellings. They appeared beneath the arms, around the groin, behind the ears, dark, swollen lumps, painful to the touch. People called them buboes, and from them the plague drew its name, the bubonic plague. These swellings grew large, some the size of an egg, others like an apple, hot and black beneath the skin. They pulsed with infection, sometimes bursting and releasing foul-smelling pus. Alongside them came headaches, weakness, and exhaustion so deep that even speaking became impossible. Within hours, bleeding began, under the skin, from the nose, the mouth. Purple blotches spread across bodies like bruises from an unseen hand. It was swift, too swift. Families saw their loved ones collapse and die within 3 to 5 days. In some cases, death came in less than a single night. A man might sit at supper with his family, speaking and laughing, only to be found cold and still by dawn. To those who lived through it, the plague was not only a sickness, it was a terror made visible. People whispered that it corrupted the very air. They called it the pestilence, or the great mortality. Some said it was divine punishment. Others believed it was spread by poisoned wells or the gaze of strangers. But whatever the explanation, the result was the same: an entire continent staring into the face of death. Children clung to mothers who could no longer rise. Husbands carried wives to mass graves. Priests who blessed the dying often fell dead before their prayers ended. The sick rooms smelled of sweat, blood, and despair. And outside, the streets echoed with silence, broken only by the wheels of carts heavy with the dead. The plague's horror was not only in its speed, but in its mystery. No one could predict who would survive and who would fall. The young died as quickly as the old, the rich as swiftly as the poor. Even the healthiest men, those who had never known sickness, found themselves broken in days. This unpredictability struck the heart of society. The realization that no wealth, no title, no power, could shield one from the pestilence. And so, as the symptoms spread, so did the fear. For each bubo was not just a swelling of flesh, it was a mark, a sentence, a sign that the end was near. If villages suffered, cities suffered more, for the plague fed upon closeness, upon crowds, upon the hum of trade and life. Florence, jewel of Italy, was among the first great cities to burn under the fire of death. Chroniclers wrote of streets littered with bodies, of doors marked with chalk to warn of infection inside. Entire households vanished in weeks. Nobles retreated to their villas in the countryside, locking gates and hoping to outlast the storm. But the storm followed. Even those who sought refuge in the hills carried it with them. In Paris, the universities and churches fell quiet. Scholars, who had debated theology days before, lay in shallow graves. Bells tolled so often that their sound became a constant dirge. The king fled to the countryside, leaving a city that was once a beacon of learning, now reduced to silence and smoke. London, across the Channel, became a place of dread. The plague arrived in 1348, carried by ships into its bustling port. The narrow streets, already filled with filth, became rivers of death. The population shrank as carts rolled through the lanes, collecting corpses. Chroniclers said there were too many dead to bury, that pits were dug so deep they swallowed thousands. Priests stood at the edge of these pits, murmuring prayers over mounds of bodies before the earth closed them forever. Markets collapsed. Trade ceased. Families locked themselves inside, but hunger forced them out. Beggars died in the streets. Merchants closed their shutters and vanished. No one could hide for long, and yet, amid the ruins, there were survivors. Some seemed untouchable, immune to the pestilence. They became both envied and feared, whispered about as chosen by God or cursed with hidden pacts. Their survival offered no comfort, only questions, only deeper mystery. In every city, the same pattern unfolded. Bustling life followed by chaos, silence, and decay. Once proud centers of trade and culture were reduced to open graves. Florence, Paris, London, each a mirror of the other, each learning that stone walls and wealth could not resist the Black Death. And beyond the cities, beyond the walls, the plague spread still further, carried by fleeing survivors, by merchants desperate for trade, by winds and rivers and tides. What had begun in Messina, what had spread through Genoa and Marseille, was now sinking its claws into the heart of Europe. The continent was unraveling, and no one yet knew how deep the ruin would go. Faith had been the anchor of medieval life. From the smallest village chapel to the great cathedrals of Chartres, Cologne, and Canterbury, the church was the constant presence in every life. It baptized the newborn, blessed the marriage bed, heard the last confession, and laid the body to rest. For centuries, people had believed that whatever suffering they endured on earth could be soothed by prayers, sacraments, and the intercession of priests. But when the plague came, the church staggered. Priests and monks, often the first to care for the sick, fell in numbers greater than any other group. They entered homes to give last rites and never returned. Entire monasteries were emptied, their cloisters silent, their libraries abandoned. The air, once filled with hymns, became heavy with the sound of hacking coughs and the tolling of funeral bells. The more the plague spread, the more desperate the prayers became. Great processions moved through cities, barefoot penitents carrying crucifixes, men and women whipping their own backs bloody in the hope that God would see their sacrifice and lift his hand from them. These flagellants roamed from town to town, chanting psalms, proclaiming judgment, and leaving behind only more fear. Yet the plague did not stop. For many, this was a wound deeper than the buboes beneath the skin. It was the realization that their protectors could not protect them, that their priests had no answer, that their bishops had no shield. If this was God's punishment, then prayers seemed useless. If it was not his punishment, then perhaps the clergy did not understand his will at all. Whispers of doubt spread in the silence left by unanswered prayers. People began to ask questions they had never dared to voice. Why would God punish his people so harshly? Why did the innocent die alongside the guilty? Why did even the holiest perish as swiftly as the sinner? The authority of the church did not collapse in a single moment, but its foundation cracked. In the centuries that followed, these cracks would widen into schisms, reforms, and revolutions. But in the dark years of the plague, it was enough that men and women began to wonder. If the church could not save them, what could? Fear demands an answer, and when answers fail, fear demands a target. As the Black Death moved from city to city, explanations multiplied like shadows. Some believed the air itself was poisoned, miasma, a corruption of the wind. Others blamed an alignment of the planets, a curse from the heavens. But whispers soon turned into accusations, and accusations into violence. The Jewish communities of Europe, already living under suspicion and restriction, became the most common scapegoat. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells with powders and potions, that they had conspired to bring death to Christian towns. In Strasbourg, Basel, and Mainz, mobs rose up. Entire communities were burned, drowned, or driven out. Synagogues were destroyed. Houses looted. Survivors scattered. The irony was cruel. Many Jewish communities had also suffered terribly from the plague. Yet in the fever of terror, reason drowned beneath waves of hatred. To kill one's neighbor seemed easier than to accept the mystery of death. But the Jews were not the only victims. Foreigners, beggars, lepers, and even wandering pilgrims were accused. Any outsider could become the focus of blame. To see a stranger in the street was to wonder if he carried powders in his cloak, if his presence was the reason your family had begun to cough. The plague was an invisible enemy, and so people created visible ones. The violence tore at the fabric of society. Fear divided town from town, neighbor from neighbor, faith from faith. Hatred that was born in panic left scars that would endure long after the plague itself had passed, and yet the plague did not stop. Burning villages, drowning communities, shedding innocent blood. It changed nothing. The carts still rolled. Through the streets, the bells still tolled, the pits still filled. In the silence after the pogroms, in the smoke that rose from burning synagogues, the truth remained. The Black Death was not a plot, not a crime, not the work of enemies. It was something larger, darker, beyond the reach of blame. But for those who lived in those years, blame was all they had. And in their desperation, they chose to believe in hatred rather than face the terror of the unknown. When the plague became impossible to ignore, people began to retreat, not only from their towns but from one another. The instinct to survive clashed with bonds of kinship, friendship, and faith. Fear cut through every connection like a knife. In cities where the death toll rose daily, families locked themselves inside their homes. Windows were shuttered, doors barred, and entire households disappeared into silence. Food was hoarded, water rationed. Neighbors who once shared bread now passed by without a glance, each fearing that even a breath of another's air might bring death. In the countryside, villages chose to wall themselves off from the world. Wooden barriers and crude ditches marked the borders of isolation. Travelers were turned away, often violently. To arrive at the gates of a quarantined village was to face spears and shouts of warning. No entry, no mercy. Those inside clung to the hope that cutting ties with the outside world might save them. Some did survive. Others found that the plague slipped in anyway, like a shadow passing through cracks in the wall. Among the wealthy, flight was the most common defense. Nobles and merchants abandoned their estates, fleeing to remote villas and castles where they surrounded themselves with servants and supplies. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio would later describe such retreats. Groups of friends gathering in country houses, filling their days with stories and songs, seeking to forget the death raging outside. Yet even these refugees were not always safe. Servants carried infection, supplies came from tainted markets, and soon the pestilence knocked at the doors of those who had thought themselves untouchable. For the poor, there was little choice but endurance. Peasants and laborers could not flee. They survived, if at all, by instinct and chance. Some drank strong wine or burned herbs, hoping to purify the air. Others clung to charms and relics, amulets of saints, prayers whispered in desperation. Few of these protections worked, yet in the absence of knowledge, hope itself became a medicine. What is most haunting is the testimony of survivors. Many wrote of the loneliness that followed isolation. Entire families disappeared behind locked doors, only to emerge weeks later as corpses dragged into carts. Neighbors vanished without farewell. Priests no longer knocked at the sickbed. Doctors refused to enter infected homes. In many places, the sick died alone, their last breath unmarked by prayer or comfort. Survival was possible, but it came at a cost. The breaking of bonds, the abandonment of neighbors, the retreat into silence. For those who endured, life became not only about escaping death, but about learning to live in a world where trust itself had died. If the cities rang with bells and cries, the countryside echoed with silence. Villages emptied. Cottages stood with doors ajar, hearths cold, tools abandoned in fields. Entire communities vanished in the space of a few weeks, leaving behind only ruins swallowed by weeds. Travelers spoke of roads lined with deserted houses, of fields where wheat grew tall but unharvested, of orchards heavy with fruit that rotted where it fell. Nature began to reclaim what man had built. Forests crept over abandoned farmland. Wolves and bears prowled closer to towns. Flocks of birds nested in the rafters of empty barns. The land itself seemed to exhale as human hands released their grip. The silence was deceptive, for it carried weight. To walk through such a village was to feel the presence of absence, the weight of lives cut short, of laughter that would never return, of prayers that had gone unanswered. Chroniclers described the eerie quiet of churchyards filled, beyond capacity, of bells that no longer tolled because there was no one left to ring them. Yet this silence also carried transformation. With so many dead, the balance of society began to shift. Fields lay fallow, but when survivors returned, they found land abundant and labor scarce. Wages rose, tenants gained leverage, and the rigid structures of feudalism began to weaken. Lords, who had once commanded many, now begged for hands to work their estates. But such changes were invisible in the moment. For those who lived through the years 1348 to 1351, what mattered most was survival in a landscape emptied of voices. A child might wander through fields where once 100 neighbors had lived, and find only the rustle of wind through grass. A farmer might pass the gates of a manor house and hear nothing but the creak of empty halls. The silence of the land was both a grave and a promise. It spoke of death, yes, but also of a future, waiting to be rewritten. Europe did not know it yet. But in the stillness of abandoned villages lay the seeds of change. The 14th century knew illness well, but it did not know medicine as we understand it today. Knowledge of the body was shaped by the teachings of Galen, a physician of Rome, and by the doctrine of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, it was said, was a balance among these fluids. Sickness, therefore, was imbalance. When the plague came, healers reached for the tools they had always known. Bloodletting was the most common. Physicians opened veins with knives or applied leeches to the skin, believing that by draining blood they might also drain the poison. Others prescribed purgatives, herbs to empty the bowels, emetics to force vomit, on the theory that corruption could be expelled. Patients already weak were often pushed closer to death. Herbal remedies multiplied. Sage, rue, wormwood, and garlic were boiled into tonics, drunk in desperation. Smoke from burning juniper or rosemary was inhaled in hopes of cleansing the lungs. Perfumed waters, vinegar, and even crushed emeralds were sold as protection. None brought salvation. Most haunting were the plague doctors. They appeared in some regions clothed in long, dark robes, gloves, and boots. Upon their heads sat the famous beaked mask, its hollow filled with herbs and sponges soaked in vinegar. They believed that the mask filtered the corrupted air. To those who saw them, these figures were not symbols of safety, but omens of death. For when the beaked doctor entered a home, it was not to cure, but to count the dying. Yet not all healers clung to ritual. In some towns, observation sharpened into early insight. People began to notice that the plague spread most swiftly in crowded places, that proximity to the sick was itself a danger. Though they lacked the language of contagion, the truth pressed against them. Death moved from body to body, touch to touch. Still, medicine remained cloaked in darkness. Without understanding of bacteria, without microscopes or knowledge of infection, every cure was guesswork, every attempt a gamble. Families placed their lives in the hands of doctors, priests, or wandering herbalists, and often buried their loved ones within days. What lingers most is the image of helplessness. The priest with his crucifix, the doctor with his beak, the mother with her charms, all facing the same black swellings, the same breath of blood, the same inevitable silence. If medicine could not stop the plague, perhaps isolation could. In Venice, the great maritime republic, leaders recognized a truth others feared to speak. Ships brought sickness. The bustling harbors, once symbols of wealth, had become gates of death. And so, the Venetians created a new law. Incoming ships were ordered to wait before docking. First 30 days, then 40. The word they used was 40 giorni, 40 days. From this came the word quarantine. 40 days at anchor was long enough, they believed, for sickness to reveal itself. If sailors survived, the ship might enter. If not, its crew was lost, and the ship remained cursed. On islands near Venice, stations were built to hold the sick, to separate them from the city. These were not hospitals as we imagine them. They were prisons of survival, places of waiting where fear was the only companion. Other cities began to copy the practice. In Dubrovnik, in Marseille, in Ragusa, officials established guarded zones where strangers were confined. Travelers arriving on horseback were held at the edge of towns. Merchants were watched, goods fumigated with smoke. Some communities turned isolation into law, others into violence, expelling foreigners, closing gates, and raising barricades. Did it work? At times, yes. Quarantine slowed the spread in certain ports, buying precious weeks. But elsewhere, panic overpowered discipline. In many towns, the fear of losing trade outweighed the fear of death, and ships continued to sail, carrying the plague with them. Yet quarantine marked a shift. It was one of the first moments in European history when society chose prevention over prayer, when walls and waiting became weapons against the unseen. It was not knowledge, not yet. But it was instinct, sharpened by desperation, and it planted the seed of what would one day become public health. Still, for those who lived through it, quarantine was not salvation. It was fear extended, silence stretched into weeks. To wait. 40 days on a ship as neighbors coughed and died was to sit in the shadow of death, measuring each dawn as both victory and torment. And in the end, even quarantine could not hold back the tide. The plague continued to spread, indifferent to walls, indifferent to law, indifferent to prayer. It slipped through borders as easily as it slipped through flesh. By the year 1350, the Black Death had swept across most of Europe. It was no longer a rumor from distant ports or a shadow creeping across borders. It was a storm that had consumed entire kingdoms, leaving behind silence and ruin. Chroniclers struggled to describe the scale of loss, for numbers alone could not hold the truth. Estimates say that 1/3, perhaps even half, of Europe's population perished. Villages that once counted 100 souls now held none. Cities that boasted tens of thousands were reduced by half within months. The bells of churches tolled so often that the sound lost all distinction. It became not a call to prayer, but a dirge for the continent. The human cost was not only in numbers, but in faces. Mothers burying children, children left to wander alone, husbands carrying wives to mass graves, priests collapsing at the altar, doctors fleeing their patients. Every life was a story cut short, every family a thread severed. In England, records show manors where 9 out of 10 peasants vanished. In France, entire villages disappeared from tax registers. In Italy, the art of the time began to reflect death in every corner. Skeletons dancing, angels mourning, demons triumphing. The landscape of culture itself was reshaped by grief. But beyond grief lay fear of extinction. Could society survive such loss? Fields went untilled, markets empty, armies weakened. With so many dead, famine threatened again. Yet somehow, amidst the ruin, some endured. The survivors bore scars not only of the body, but of the soul. To live through the Black Death was to carry the weight of absence, of every empty chair, every silenced voice, every churchyard overflowing with the dead. The human cost of the plague was not measured in years, but in generations. For long after the pestilence had passed, its shadow remained, etched into memory, into art, into the very rhythm of daily life. And yet, from devastation came transformation. The Black Death had torn Europe apart, but in its ruins lay the seeds of a new world. With so many dead, labor became precious. Survivors who once bent beneath the weight of feudal lords now found themselves in demand. Wages rose, serfs gained bargaining power, and the rigid chains of feudalism began to loosen. Some lords tried to resist, to bind peasants once more, but resistance flared into rebellion. Slowly, the old order began to crack. Cities, though scarred, discovered resilience. With populations reduced, there was more land, more opportunity, for those who survived. Merchants sought new routes, artisans gained patrons, and new wealth flowed into fewer hands, accelerating change. Out of the silence of the plague years, voices of innovation began to rise. Even the church, wounded and weakened, could not escape transformation. Faith remained, but authority was questioned. People who had watched priests die helplessly now asked harder questions of their shepherds. This quiet doubt would one day blossom into movements of reform, schism, and rethinking of spiritual authority. Culturally, the obsession with death reshaped art and literature. The dance macabre, the dance of death, appeared in paintings and carvings, reminding all that mortality was the great equalizer. Writers recorded not only sorrow, but reflection, asking what it meant to live, to die, to endure. In this soil of despair, the seeds of humanism and the Renaissance would take root. The Black Death was not only an end, it was also a beginning. It was a crucible that burned away old certainties and left space for new ways of thinking, new ways of living. Its shadow darkened a century, but within that shadow, Europe began its long transformation toward the modern age. The Black Death ended not with a single victory, nor with a cure, but with exhaustion. By the mid-1350s, the pestilence loosened its grip, leaving behind a continent scarred but not destroyed. The silence that followed was heavy. as if the very air remembered what had passed. Across Europe, survivors stepped out into a changed world. Where once streets had been crowded, now grass grew through broken stones. Where once bells rang in celebration, now towers stood mute. The plague had cut into every layer of society, reshaping life in ways no one could have foreseen. The first legacy was loss. Families were shattered, names erased from memory. Many villages vanished entirely, never rebuilt, their fields returning to wilderness. In cities, whole neighborhoods lay abandoned. The absence of so many people left a wound that could not be healed in a single generation. Yet from that absence came change. With fewer people, land was suddenly plentiful. Laborers could demand higher wages. Peasants could seek better terms. The chains of feudalism weakened. Lords who once commanded obedience found themselves forced to bargain. In England, this tension would eventually erupt into revolt. In other kingdoms, it shifted the balance of power, opening space for the slow birth of a new economic order. The how. Church, too, was altered. Its failure to shield the people, its silence in the face of overwhelming death, left seeds of doubt. Faith did not disappear. If anything, piety often grew stronger, but trust in authority was shaken. This fracture would widen over the next centuries, until reformers and rebels challenged the very foundations of Christian Europe. Culturally, the shadow of the plague lingered in every work of art, every story, every song. The obsession with death became visible in the dance macabre, skeletons leading kings and peasants alike in a final dance. Literature carried the memory, from Boccaccio's Decameron to chronicles written in cloisters. Even architecture bore the mark. Chapels raised to honor the dead, cemeteries expanded into new lands, ossuaries filled with bones stacked like libraries of mortality. But perhaps the deepest legacy was in the mind. Europeans learned that their world was fragile, that life could vanish overnight, that no wealth or power could guarantee safety. This awareness fed both fear and imagination. It drove men and women to seek new answers, new sciences, new ways of understanding the world beyond prayer alone. From this soil of devastation, the Renaissance would rise, a rebirth born out of ruin. The Black Death did not end in the 14th century. It returned again and again, in lesser waves, haunting Europe for centuries. But the first great outbreak remained unmatched in its terror and its transformation. It was both an ending and a beginning, a night that seemed eternal yet carried the first glimmers of dawn. To speak of its legacy is to speak not only of death, but of survival. For though millions fell, millions endured. They rebuilt, reimagined, and reshaped their world. They carried forward memory, not as chains, but as warnings and lessons. The plague had taught them the frailty of flesh, but also the resilience of spirit. And so the story of the Black Death is not only a tale of horror, it is also a tale of endurance. It is the reminder that even in the darkest shadow, humanity continues to seek light. The legacy of the plague is written not only in bones and chronicles, but in the very shape of the world we inhabit today.